Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on integrating BIM into NEC contracts. We've had a few technical issues unfortunately so far today, so hopefully you'll be able to bear with us and the screen shouldn't freeze. If it does, please do bear with us as we move through the rest of the slides. So in terms of today's webinar, presenting is myself, Ian Heaphy. I'm a member of the NEC4 Contract Board, and I've been involved in drafting the NEC4 contracts and also X10, the Information Modelling Protocol within the contract we're going to talk about today.
And my name is Richard Patterson. I've been with NEC a few years now, do a lot of training for NEC, and was also lucky enough to be part of the drafting team for NEC4.
In terms of the webinar today, we have an agenda to go through, but as with all previous webinars, we have the opportunity for you to ask questions. There should be a screen or box on your screen that allows you to post questions. So please feel free to post any questions at any time, and we will answer them either through the webinar itself or probably keep most of them to the end and go through them in a Q&A session.
Okay.
Let's then look at the NEC approach to information modelling in NEC3 and as it related to the first version of the CIC protocol, just very briefly on that. And then we're going to look in some detail at NEC4 X10 and the secondary option of information modelling. And then we'll look at how that works together with the CIC protocol and talk about the practice note that NEC has produced to cover that issue. And then towards the end, we'll talk about tips and tactics for using the NEC X10 with X12, the CIC protocol, and how best to use those documents together.
Which is a bit of concern. We've got quite a lot to get through here, so we'll see how we go. We'll move on. Very high level information modelling. What is information modelling? I can see my screen's frozen. I hope it hasn't frozen for you.
It's back again.
It's back again. That's good. So what is information modelling? It's just a way of pulling together design teams normally to pull together common data, common systems. Sorry, got slightly IT issues coming up here. I'm hoping we're okay. Trying to get a joined up approach basically to the design and construction process. And the one thing we will say here is that it's called in NEC terms information modelling, where in the world, of course, we're using the term BIM. Don't worry about that, but NEC language here, we've chosen.
More about terminology later on, but the key thing is that there is no real consistency across the globe around the terminology for BIM. I think even in the UK, the use of the term BIM, building information modelling, is being sort of challenged or questioned, as in, is it limiting to buildings, not sort of earthwork embankments, dams, that kind of thing. We've chosen some specific terminology that we've used within the X10, which may be slightly different to British standards, to the PAS and other things. But really, we have to have a set of definitions that link to the contract that explain what the terminology means, in the same way the protocol produced by CIC has a series of definitions. And so we've used terms that we think are descriptive of what they cover. Obviously, if the industry does move to a set of standard terms, then we could possibly follow suit around that.
Things may move on.
But different parts of the world have different terms for BIM even. You go to somewhere like India, they have VDC, Virtual Design and Construction. In America, they use different terms, VDC, also VBE. So, there's no consistency of terminology, unfortunately. So, yes, we have some slightly different terms, but they are explained and defined within the contract.
Right. Okay. So, moving on from there, BIM as a very high level stuff. Most of you will be aware of this. The government has set out 4 levels of BIM. We're supposed to be at level 2, which is effectively federated separate models. Interestingly, if you read through the recent Winfield Rock report, very good report on the status of BIM, suggests that nobody's really properly defined what it is, which is quite ironic. What we're moving towards is a seriously integrated model, which may lead to even further tweaks and changes in the way that we do our contractual interface with BIM. Also, as we've got levels, but we've also got what's become known as the dimensions of BIM. So 3 dimensions, X, Y, Z, for what you're putting into this thing. Your various elements of assets. We can include for the cost, we can include carbon, we can include operational costs and so on. BIM can have ultimate number, any number really, of dimensions, and this is growing as BIM develops. So this idea of dimensions, in terms of the numbering of these dimensions, there's no real standard. Some people call the cost and sequence in different, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. But again, in time, they will probably get better standardized, I'm thinking.
Yeah, and it comes back to the idea of, terminology. We're still developing what we mean by the levels,
indeed,
by these dimensions, etc. So we are on a journey.
We're certainly on a journey with BIM. Again, there are many people out there that are much more focused on BIM than I am. I'm a contract specialist, Ian's a procurement and contract specialist. But about there are a significant number of PASs, publicly available specifications, developing the language and the rules to be used in putting together and making BIM work. We're here today to look at the interface between that and the contracts. So I put here, it's a mystery. It's a mystery to me, and I haven't spent the time getting familiar with those details, I'll be quite honest. I understand that there is a move to move those towards an ISO standard at some time. PAS, I think, is a very UK-specific group, I believe.
Yeah,
tell me if I'm wrong.
Sure. Well, see
but in 5 years' time, there'll be an ISO for all this. But so we're on a journey. When NEC first came out, information modelling wasn't really talked to us. 2004 Industry Council, which again is very UK focused, broad church, but UK focused, they came up with the CIC protocol for BIM in 2013, already 5 years old. And as we'll see in a minute, that has recently been updated this year, has been updated to CIC Rev 2. So I'm going to skip through Rev 1 very, very quickly to save us a bit of time for later.
Yep. Basic
principles, yes, there's a protocol, build it in the same way to everybody's contract. We're in a scenario here, Ian, where the employer's got maybe 3 or 4 different people contributing to a BIM model. Most likely stages at the early stage where we've got the architect, structural engineer and so on working together to input into a model. So the BIM protocol was designed to be included in all those contracts. Critically, it had an Appendix 1, which was what was called the Model Production Delivery Table, who, I love the word, they use the word term drop, who puts information, what information they put in and when. That was set out in this one magic table, which is really the crux of who's got to do what when.
Yeah.
There was also information, Appendix 2, which was the micro detail about exactly how the information is to be provided, so-called the information requirements.
Okay. And I'm right, I think you're saying that in that original protocol, the way it worked was as it was incorporated into these separate contracts.
There's a lot of people that were concerned about the sort of overriding this. You can use BIM, it takes precedence over everything else in your contract, which for a lot of clients wasn't appropriate. And we'll see in a minute that's been diluted a little bit in Rev 2. Okay, so at that time, NEC produced a very short guidance note on how to stick together BIM with this protocol in CIC contracts. That's a document which has been available for, as you can see, back in 2013.
Yeah, I think with that, though, in fairness, it was slightly broader than just how to incorporate the CIC protocol.
Okay, it was a bit wider.
Yeah, there was some general guidance on how to use BIM with NEC contracts,
right,
explaining how the technical contents will form part of the works information, looking at parties' rights, responsibilities, maybe producing Z clauses. So it was designed to be protocol neutral, but then there was some specific guidance and clauses relating to the CIC BIM protocol.
Okay, which is coming on the next slide, I think.
Absolutely.
Even then, there was a recommendation that parties should be starting to think about using X12, which we'll come on to a little bit later.
Yeah.
So that's just a snapshot directly from that guidance about expressly how to use the CIC Revision 1, remember, now superseded, into an NEC contract. We'll leave that for a takeaway slide. I'm not going to go through the detail. Then, Ian, NEC4.
NEC4, well, hopefully, as most of you are familiar with now, NEC4 was released in June 2017. As part of the release, we introduced a new secondary option, X10 Information Modeling. Read that as building information modeling, but as we discussed already at some length, terminology is something that is an issue across the whole sort of BIM arena. The name we chose was to be broader than just BIM buildings, to cover for the other types of work that can be done under the contracts, some of which may not even be necessarily directly construction related.
Yeah.
So X10 is included in all of the main contracts. So all of the non-short contracts. And also it's worth noting, and we'll touch on this later, that the X10 is subtly different in the DBO and alliance contracts to the other main contracts. So the way it works in the main contracts, ECC, PSE, TSE, etc., that the clause is designed to be used with or without a BIM or information model protocol.
Right.
The idea is the clauses, the secondary option, touches on all the contractual aspects of BIM. So whether BIM has a contractual impact or significance, we have clauses to cover it. Mm-hmm. So this primarily deals with things like ownership of project information, yep, and who owns the information model, which in this version of X10 sits with the client. Okay. The client is the person who creates the model, may have an existing model, or if it's being created through the project, they'll be the one who will coordinate that information. It will come to them to drop into their model that they will host.
Okay. And all that will be set out in the information model requirements.
Absolutely.
The micro process for doing that.
Absolutely. Okay. And it could be that the client engages a professional consultant through a PSC to host it for them.
Right.
But from the other members of the supply chain, they see the client as the person who is hosting that model.
Right. Okay.
Because when it comes to things like liability for faults and errors, what we have there is a clear demarcation that faults in the project information, so the information supplied by contractor, consultant, etc. Right. That responsibility for liability sits with them, as you would expect.
Yep.
They have to supply that in accordance with the information model itself.
Right.
They combine that data, they take liability and responsibility for that combination and the resulting end product.
Right.
Unless the fault is due to a fault in the project information supplied by contractor, consultant, etc.
Which is logical, because fundamentally the client's made a decision at the start to procure via separate contracts.
Yeah.
And therefore they're holding the responsibility in the middle.
Exactly. And that's how we see it. It's a clear demarcation.
Okay.
And it sets, a starting point for that liability and who carries what.
Okay.
Also, we have an information execution plan, and that is how project is issued by the contractor. And we'll talk more about that shortly.
Okay.
Okay, in terms of the design, build, operate contract and the alliance contract, slightly different approach to X10 in these contracts, because these are sort of largely
it's still called X10, but it's subtly different words.
It's still
important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still called X10, but there are, and a lot of it is still the same.
Right.
You have information execution plans.
The language is all the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there are just some slight changes in liability.
Okay.
Because the idea here is, with the DBO, the alliance contracts, they're sort of turnkey arrangements.
Yeah.
Where the client is saying to a contractor in the DBO contract or the alliance as a whole, which they'll be part of in the ALC contract, that team or that group will produce the model for the client. So they take liability for not just producing the project information, but also the information model.
Right.
And then they take the liability for any faults or errors in the project information and the information model, because they are producing it for the client and they hand it over at the end.
Right.
Also worth noting, the DBO standard liability is fitness for purpose. So that would apply to the information model, which could be a little bit scary in certain geographies around what the risk that could pose.
Yeah.
But there is the option to have X18 to limit liability in relation to that contract is being released in June this year. That contract has a very shared risk to approach to risk, in that most of the risks are shared by the members of the alliance, including in relation to the information model.
Okay, logical. So if I just ping through that, that's a pretty picture of the stuff in X10.
Yeah. So this is X10 in relation to the ECC, the PSC. So this is not the DBO ALC model. It's for the other contracts. So what we have is we have contract data part 1 that will contain a reference to the scope, what used to be works information in old NEC3 terminology. And within that, we have a subsection called information model requirements.
Right.
And that is where the client will detail the specific information that each contractor or consultant has to provide through the contract.
And how it's going to be for the micro detail,
Absolutely. All the relevant information to give life to the information model and the information to be supplied by contractor consultants. So then, as you see on the slide in the middle there, you have the information model that is held by the client, and then project information on the left-hand side that is fed in by the contractor or the consultant to create or change the model, which may be existing or being complete, etc. And that will contain dates when information will be supplied to meet the requirements of the information model requirements. And also with X10, we have this information execution plan, the how to provide information.
This is the contractor's how-do side, specific to the modelling issues.
Specific to the information they have to provide, the format of that information, etc.
Okay.
And those documents, accepted program, information execution plan, can form part of contract data part 2. Be accepted at tender stage when contracts formed, or probably more commonly, they will be submitted afterwards.
So it's the same, basically we've got the same approach to the accepted program as we have to the information execution plan.
Absolutely.
Hence the dotted lines on the pretty picture.
Okay. So in terms of the contents of X10, we talk about how the contractor has to collaborate with other information providers to provide information, read that as consultant under the PSC, etc. So the idea here, placing this additional requirement to collaborate, come back to the idea there'll be multiple parties producing the information model. The project information has to be submitted in the form stated within the information model requirements. That determines the type of data, the form of data, how it's provided, and also you would specify in the information model requirements, and also any limitations of ownership around the information model and the contractor's rights over project information can also form part of that information model requirements.
Okay, so
if there are to be.
Okay, that's got to be obviously dealt with very, very carefully, stating the obvious. But those are all the references from X10 specifically to information requirements to make sure those get covered. And that information model requirements then, if I've got 3 different consultants or contractors feeding into my model under 3 separate contracts, is that the same document?
Potentially so. I mean, it depends a little bit on who's being engaged and at what time. So it could be you have an existing information model, you have a design and build contractor who is doing some refurbishment or some major refurbishment work, but they are the sole sort of provider of that. Therefore, they're the only person providing new data into the existing model. You know, more likely there will be a combination of providers, designers, other contractors, and they will have to be consistent in how they supply information.
But a client in setting up this arrangement with more than one contract has got to be they've got to be careful how that information model requirements is set up. And at the very least, it'll be logical to make sure that the most of that is consistent across the patch with the different providers. Okay. Then we've got this information execution plan, which is...
So that is a plan for how. We still have the program, accepted program in the contract that's going to discuss when information will be provided. So this is more about how it's to be provided. There could be a linkage across to the program. It could be a subset. There could be some extraction of dates within it. But we're not trying to replace the program here with this document.
I think that's important.
Okay. As we already discussed, like the NEC program, pointed to from the contract data part 2, required within X weeks of the contract dates. But unlike the program, again, this is important. There's no standard rule on its content. There's no sort of 31 coming back to the dimensions, etc. It's going to be very specific to.
So NEC's made a conscious decision to leave that open, leave that required to be user specified. Okay.
Which I think most protocols do because of the it's moving so quick and so fast. It's hard to be prescriptive.
Understood.
Okay. And then any requirements for the information execution plan are covered in the information model requirements.
And I guess the same question for me. I've got 4 different consultants. Have I got 4 separate information execution plans, or am I going to try and get them joined up?
I suppose a simplistic answer is yes, you would, in the sense of all the contracts within the NEC suite, apart from the new Alliance contract, are bi-party contracts. So the execution plan is only going to bind that party.
So it's very definitely a bi-party document.
But you're making a very valid point. Come back to collaboration. The idea is BIM is joining up lots of probably different information providers. The need for consistency is important to make sure that you have these things interlinked.
I think if I was doing it, I would be trying to use X12, and X12 I'd require the partners to get together a week before the submission of another information execution plan and get it consistent. Otherwise I've got the project manager on the client side with 4 different information information execution plans to look at the end of the month, which is
customized as and when necessary.
Yeah.
So the contractor may decide, or consultant PSC decide when they need to revise and reissue it.
Right.
And also, if you have a compensation that maybe affects the scope of the works, what has to be done,
to change it.
That could also change it.
Okay.
Okay. I think just come back to your point a moment ago there that, you know, the nature of X10 and the ECC, PSC, etc., is the client is holding the model and has to coordinate the input of the others, albeit we're looking for them to collaborate and work together, which, as you say, X12 will help and assist in that.
Yeah. Okay. Moving swiftly, a bit more detail.
Liability, I've touched on this already, really. So client's liabilities, they are a fault or error in the information model, other than a defect contained within the project information. That delineation between, as long as the contractor consultant does what the scope requires them to do, they can't be held liable for what happens to it next.
Which is just wonderfully logical.
And you know, if there's a fault in other information providers' data that then requires a revision or redesign or whatever by the contractor or another consultant, that would also be a client's liability. And of course, bear in mind that client's liabilities in this context would also be grounds for compensation events.
Right.
Okay. And in terms of, again, aside from the DBO and the ALC, the contractor consultant is liable for their project information on the basis of a test of reasonable skill and care, not fitness for purpose.
Okay. Other bits and pieces?
Okay, so you know, it's interesting that when you look to things like the CIC protocol, they have a consistent information manager who would be responsible for coordinating the supply of data from all of the individual contractors, consultants who have that protocol within their contracts. We haven't got that approach. You know, the way that each of the NEC4 contracts works, you have the project manager or service manager, etc., who manages that contract on behalf
as a whole.
As a whole. And so they would then undertake the role of information manager, if you like. They're responsible for coordinating the data, making sure that each supplier in the supply chain is providing that data.
But to be clear, we haven't got information manager as a named entity in X10, but there are certain roles within X10 which would logically be done by that person. So I can imagine on a significant job, I can imagine the project manager or the service manager for a construction or a professional services contract having a delegate appointed as the effectively to act under those clauses as a de facto information manager.
Absolutely, that could well be the way to go for a client. They want consistency of approach. The client can say to their project manager under the ECC, the service manager under a PSC, you will delegate these functions to this person, and therefore you have a single person undertaking that activity.
Right. But again, it just shows up. BIM needs a joined up approach, and NEC with it needs a joined up approach, and all these things are heading in the same direction.
Okay, in terms of the CIC protocol, we're going to talk more about the second edition, but in terms of the first edition, it had this delivery table where information be provided, the drops of data by where, when, by whom, at what level and what standards, that sort of thing is not explicitly covered within the X10 information modelling clauses. That will be left to be provided as part of the information model requirements. Again, allowing it to be specific to that particular BIM solution.
But we've seen from the CIC that sort of tabular approach makes sense. So we've got the same table for everybody. So we don't say that expressly in X10, but it's likely to happen, isn't it? Or it should be happening.
But you need a similar sort of content. Perhaps when we look at the second edition, we can touch more on that particular issue.
Okay, let's move on. So as of, I think it was April this year, CIC, obviously reviewing, things are moving on. They came out with Rev 2 of their protocol, and we'll take you through that very briefly. Again, 10 clauses, same story, put them all into the same contract, same version, please don't play about with it too much. Now, instead of what used to be called the model production delivery table, we've now got a renamed Appendix 1 responsibility matrix, information particulars.
But is that largely the same?
Largely the same thing. It's literally just a change of name from what I can work out, really. And it's more clear, isn't it? Responsibility. I like that. It's a bit of NEC clarity going on here. There's also specific provisions for security, which we're not going to have time to go into, but it's there in Appendix 3. Fundamental obligations of the team member is to use the common data environment. Obviously, we're going to have a completely meaningless acronym for it. the CDE, Common Data Environment, to process the responsibility matrix. So it's all in that one key document.
Yeah.
Perversely, in my humble opinion, the protocol says, or maybe we'll put the time somewhere else. I think that's a silly idea. Would you agree? Best place for it is in that table, isn't it? It's got to be.
It would seem that is the primary function of it.
Of the table.
And interesting that we have Common Data Environment. That term isn't used in X10. The Common Data Environment would be described or covered within the
information
model requirements.
Yeah. Okay, good point. That responsibility matrix, given that it's such a key document, I found it was rather odd there was no standard format for it in the protocol, but those are the sort of things, the columns I would expect to see, who's got to provide what when, basically. We'll leave it at that. In terms of the timing linking, this is an issue that I've maybe got myself too worried about. We'll see. The CIC Protocol 1 had an unhelpful line which said anything unreasonable, which basically gave a new compensation event. They now say we'll do what it says in the responsibility matrix, subject to anything which would give you an extension of time under the agreement, which is logical and fine.
So i.e. compensation.
In NEC language, a compensation. Sorry, good thing. I forget we're on NEC. The client might want a more clear remedy for the supplier being late. So we've got all these dates set out in the appendix, and we want people to stick with those dates. As an extreme case, this is a linking back to the actual contract. NEC, as most of you will know, in terms of timescales, we can either have a section completion, which is not appropriate, or we can have a key date, which says meet a certain condition by a key date. In this case, the condition would be you have dropped the stuff as required by row 23 of the responsibility matrix. If you wanted to do that though, and I like the idea because you then got these key dates and the contract's got processes for dealing with them and indeed moving them backwards in the case of a compensation event. But if you're going to do that, then be careful because the standard NEC has a fairly, it has the undetermined, unpredetermined,
unliquidated
in old language, in 25.3. So you might want to tweak that and maybe turn that back to predetermined damage and maybe be radical and turn that to nil and then rely on the wider incentives on the project to make sure your team is going to complete. That's where we go back to X12 again. But
I think there's a couple of things on that. I mean, if you did use key dates, you say maybe make it nil, some sort of Z clause to do that. Alternatively, if you left it as it was, it would be interesting to see what actually would be the cost that others would incur as a result of that failure.
Indeed.
How would that be assessed? Could be interesting in itself. Also, you mentioned key dates as a way of getting these dates identified in the program and having them able to be changed. I think what you could do in the information model requirements is set these dates or require these dates to be shown within the program, because you can add content to the program through the scope. And then, as we have within X10, generally where you have a compensation, there may be some additional scope or scope changes that would then require changes to the scope, i.e. the dates for these dates. The drops would change, and that could be where dealing.
But then you've got to require the dates, which you have with the key date.
I think there's pros and cons, but it is an interesting one to consider for users if they are using X10 with or without the CIC protocol, where the key dates may be a vehicle to achieve delivery by certain dates, or more positive incentives, which I know you'll touch on shortly with X12.
Okay. Appendix 2 is the protocol's information particulars. 3 things. Firstly, information requirements, employee information requirements. Secondly, the BIM execution plan, which is where we've said, and we'll say again, we think that is the constraints, requirements of the BIM execution plan rather than the plan itself. And then the protocol gives us another list of other things that you ought to have covered if you haven't already got them in your information requirements. So it's just like a checklist, really.
Say a checklist, some sort of list of contents for that document, things to consider, which is very useful.
Okay. Again, we'll come to that again. I think that's very odd that execution plan is there in this information particulars. We'll come to that again in just a moment. Security requirements, I'm going to skip over because we're going to be running out of time, to be honest. I think it's just, you need to look at that if you've got particular security issues and set out, as you can see there, sensitive information, any specific requirements relating to security. And again, I understand, but I don't know, that a lot of that is defined lower down in these PAS arrangements.
Again, it's a good set of contents to consider in relation to that, and security, as we know, has become more and more important to people.
Indeed. In terms of changing things, there's a sort of very succinct one-liner in the protocol. The employer shall arrange for the information particulars responsibility to be reviewed and updated if necessary. It's sort of fairly general, sort of chatty language at each project stage. But those particulars, and particularly that responsible information, they are NEC scope. So as soon as the employer goes changing those, in reality, it's the project manager in an ECC contract.
Yep.
That's going to be a change of scope, which will inevitably be a compensation event, which we'll have to look at in a normal
and
NEC
that will
way.
flow through into X10 to changes to the information execution plan, etc.
And so on. Again, the employer's obligation to provide that common data environment, I think we've said, it's their job to do that. And talking to my BIM people around McDonald, where I live, most people are thinking that it's probably better to have that CDE provided under a separate supply by a specialist that does that sort of thing.
Yeah, and again, that plays a little bit towards X10 and how that's set up under the ECC, PSC, etc.
Yeah.
Whereby we have the client hosting the model, data being provided by those providers to the client to go into that model.
Yeah.
In other words, they would be hosting the CDE.
Okay, I'm going to move on. We've also got the employer's information manager, whose job is to perform the role in connection with the project, includes establishment and management of processes, basically make sure people are following what it says, hopefully, in your employer's information requirements.
Managing the protocol, the requirements of the protocol.
Yeah. As we've already said, that's logically the same person in each contract, if we can make it that way as a delegate, which we've said. Same thing applies to what we call the built asset security manager, which is a person looking after the security aspects.
Yeah, and again, just to reinforce slightly that the idea is the client under X10 would have the function through the PMs and SMs to manage that coordination, delegating to one person, or somebody, if you like, at the client level manages each of the PMs and SMs in relation to X10.
Right. Okay, now, as we said, NEC was working very closely with CIC when so Ian here was being part of the team drafting the scope. So I'll let Ian take you through how NEC says we should be dealing with it.
Yeah, so NEC recognises the success of the CIC BIM protocol, particularly in the UK and its adoption. We're very keen to support users who want to use it moving forward. So we've introduced a practice note. It's a free issue document you can download from the NEC website, which explains how you can incorporate the second edition of the CIC BIM protocol into the contract as part of X10. So you'd select X10 and then you would incorporate the CIC BIM protocol as part of that. And the way it works is that the CIC BIM protocol becomes part of the information model requirements within the scope.
Okay. So basically we're putting the whole CIC with its bits is the information with the model requirements.
Such a couple of tweaks we'll talk about later.
Okay.
There is some terminology differentials, as we say, this inconsistency use of BIM terms in different protocols and documents. We have some some clarity around how the equivalent terms work in the ECC, PSC, etc. compared to the BIM protocol. Phrases like project manager would have to be service manager for the TSC, PSC.
Okay.
Okay. One of the key things to bear in mind, though, is the protocol still contains a sort of order of precedence type clause.
Yeah.
And we've actually said to exclude that, to delete it, because the contract already deals with inconsistencies, ambiguities, priority of documents. It's the contract has a mechanism to resolve. And then the idea is the protocol plus the appendices form that information model requirements.
Okay. I think we've already said all this before. We're saying again the same stuff. Protocol Appendix 2 includes the BIM execution plan.
And we'll touch on that in a moment. So, in terms of stitching these documents together, we need to make sure that within Appendix 2 of the protocol, which is now part of the information model requirements, you address all the information to be included in the information model requirements.
Which is what we've already talked through before.
As we touched upon before, the collaboration requirements, the form of the project information, and any kind of information execution plan, all of which, I think would form part of that anyway. Okay, and then this slide is just useful just to show how, relating back to X10 and the previous slides, now X10 with the CIC protocol, in effect that just forms part of, or maybe the entirety of, the information model requirements, and that contains the protocol and the appendices. Okay, and then just in relation to that, the point you're alluding to there, Richard, around that the protocol talks about the information execution plan being part of Appendix 2, i.e. part of NEC speak of the scope. And our view is actually that should only, in the scope section, if you like, contain the requirements for what has to be provided within the information execution plan. That is a document that is provided by the supply chain. It comes from the supply side. You don't want it in the scope because you don't want the PM to have power to unilaterally change it. It is the supply chain's document.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, it's a simple thing, but quite a key thing, I think, on this whole issue.
So, Richard, you mentioned X12.
Well, I've mentioned X12 a few times. Yeah, very briefly. X12 has been around for years, right from the start of NEC3. Used to be called partnering, which was a misnomer. It should have been called multi-party collaboration. It is now. Basic idea is that we can have a way of joining up the separately engaged, still the bi-party contracts that Ian's talked about. We've still got bi-party contracts. We haven't jumped to the alliance world. In that scenario, though, each have X12 included in their contracts. The client is detail, but the top of that tree is the promoter, but it's normally the same person as the client. And the functions of X12, firstly, you have a core group, which is a routine discussion between the big cheeses of the various partners. They collaborate as stated in the partnering information, which I've mentioned a few times in this chat today. So this is a standalone document, and as we'll see, it becomes part of everybody's contract. So within the partnering information, we might have rules and requirements to do with the BIM issues, as we've talked about. Within X12 also, we have a schedule of partners. Most importantly, it sets out joint targets for performance. And in typical NEC ways, it doesn't try and tell you how to write those targets. It just gives your framework to do so. So it's up to you as a client, the team, and not the individual. So this is an attempt at the collaborative glue to pull these guys together. And if one thing is true, we know that if we're going to work collaborative, if we're going to do BIM, we need collaboration. And therefore, we need contracts that can encourage that collaboration. And X12 in NEC is the most collaborative element, if you like, within.
And so, for example, then you could have within that partnering information, the need to collaborate around X10 information modeling to supply the information, setting KPIs around data being dropped at certain stages, in certain timescales, interaction between those different partners, and incentivize it positively. And it's worth just bearing in mind that X12 only ever works as a positive incentive to encourage performance. There's no negative reduction in payment if people fail to achieve certain dates. That's maybe back to the
that's how X12 has been designed for. So pretty picture of that. If this is our arrangement of bi-party contracts, including subcontracts, X12 is a bunch of paper, entries in the contract data and the partnering information, and those same entries are included in whatever contracts you want to put them in. You might even put them in a subcontract. You might even put them in a consultant's contract, but poor old contractor queue is not important enough to be X12. But again, that's a client's decision as to how collaborative we want to make things.
I think we'd recommend it, in fairness, not that it shows it on the slide.
Indeed.
The more involved on that basis, the better, if they're providing
probably
information.
The better, indeed. So if we're going to, can we do X12? Can we do X10 without a protocol in?
Yeah, I mean, we have designed this practice note to say how to use X10 with the CIC BIM protocol, but when we drafted X10 originally, it was designed to be protocol neutral, or not even need a protocol. Because in fairness, the reason why you have a protocol generally is to deal with the contractual aspects of BIM in terms of liability, ownership, documentation, what happens if people don't do things, who owns what, etc. And we cover that within X10. So we've already covered those touch points, we believe. Always a question whether there's other things we need to add to that. But obviously we have the scope, and within that the information model requirements to put further flesh on the bones if needs be around contractual issues, because all documents are of equal standing in NEC world. And then other part of the protocol, for example, the CIC protocol, the appendices is the project specific detail. Which again you can incorporate via the information model requirements.
Horses for courses, I guess. But I guess we're saying that in the UK, where people have been looking for a protocol for BIM, trying to standardise, and if the UK industry at least is standardising on CIC Rev 2, then I'm guessing that most people would say it makes sense to use that rather than redraft it yourself.
We have absolutely no, and we have. That's why we got the practice note to explain how that can be done. There's no need to use it, but why not? If you like, if it's there, if people are familiar with it, it does what it needs to do.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we've done most of the detail then. So
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot. Hopefully we've covered them stuff with some use. Moving forward though, I think, and this was a quote I took straight out of the Winfield Rock report, somebody writing or giving their views said, the only way we're going to go forward with BIM is some sort of alliancing. Well, that's good, because coming in June,
funnily enough,
yeah, because you've been heavily involved in drafting,
absolutely.
I believe.
So come the NEC Users Group Conference in the UK, it will be a great contract to use and select for BIM, information modelling, because it will create this collaboration, the partners working together, the model being something they produce as a group, the liabilities, the risk generally being shared, and so making the people work together to achieve the ultimate aims of all of them, and they all get a share in that success.
But hopefully we've explained today that if you're not ready to be jumping into an alliance, and there may be good reasons why you're not be on a certain project, then with a bit of thought, you can use X12 to do the stitching, to do the joining up, to help these parties collaborate.
Okay, that's pretty much it in terms of the actual sort of slides themselves. We'll now move over to some questions and just see what people want to ask us around that.
We did finish off. We just said we're still moving. When I first started these slides a year ago for other purposes, you know, everything's moving, everything's changing. BIM is moving very, very fast. Hopefully, as a result of an hour today, you've got some basic understanding of how these things fit together. And NEC will obviously continue to try and support NEC and BIM across the industry.
Okay, just in that some of the questions we've received. Will this PowerPoint be shared? That'll be made available on the.
I recommend you force them to listen. Yes.
Okay. There's quite a few technical things that people have flagged up around what we said. Okay. So in terms of BIM and the future for it, Richard, you know, we've got CIC BIM Protocol. Are you aware of any other organisations that are producing it in other parts of the world?
Personally, I'm not. I haven't done the research on that. I don't know. I'm sure it's happening around the world, basically.
Okay, the question about the ISO group set up to standardise the global approach to BIM. I
don't understand. This is a question from Paul Krenner here. My BIM people have said that there is a draft of the ISO knocking around, but I'm not sure. I'm not directly involved in that. So apologies to that. Somebody here pointing out the point that Ian was saying, BIM, should we get rid of building because it implies we can't do anything else? That's what we've said.
Well, that's what we have in X10. We call it information modelling.
That's what we said.
Rightly or wrongly. And again, it's interesting because we get quite a bit of feedback saying, why have you changed it? You're changing it for the sake of changing it. Yet other people are saying it needs to be changed. Indeed. So it's always a fine line to walk around that.
Richard Palmer, who travaille en France, c'est très bien. And is it intended that these BIM recommendations are applicable to Europe? Well, yes, there's nothing cousins to have a look at NEC. That'll be great.
Yeah, certainly. You know, the NEC contracts are designed to be used in any jurisdiction. X10 is therefore designed for any jurisdiction. As you say, the CIC protocol, whilst maybe coming again like the NEC does from a UK background, I believe doesn't have any constraints and issues internationally.
I must give NEC's apologies. We've got quite a lot of comments here about issues and problems. I do apologise on behalf of NEC, but the webinar hopefully has been recorded. If not, we'll have another go. And we'll get that shared on the NEC's website.
A question of clarification there from Greg, which was, is the information execution plan another term for the BIM execution plan outlined in PAS?
Yes.
And the answer is yes.
Answer is yes, and that's what it says in that first in the guidance note where we say with that terminology, the slide there showing the terminology. That's in there straight away.
Yeah, and again, the terminology change is purely to do with information modelling as opposed to building information modelling, which we've already touched upon.
You may want to stop the video.
On the obligation of fitness for purpose, any insurance issues, particularly around personal damage insurance? Yeah, I mean, the DBO is different to all other, saying all other NEC contracts in that it has a fitness for purpose obligation within it, and there's no second option to reduce that. The idea being a DBO is a true turnkey contract whereby it's difficult to start splitting out different issues or errors in construction as opposed to design.
Yeah.
So whilst we recognise that that may be unpalatable to certain companies, that's the starting point. As we mentioned, we've got X18 to cap liability to give some safeguard around that, though it's not types of liability, it's the amount of liability that is capped.
Yeah, I can see being the usual debate. Between bidder and client. The bidder's always going to want to due skill and care. X15, I don't think is in the DBO contract, but it wouldn't be rocket science to steal it from ECC and put it in DBO. So
should you wish to, but I say, but it does just then create that issue of trying to split out, is it design or is it the construction as a fault? There's a court case from Scotland not so long ago which had exactly that as part of the debate. And also bear in mind again, the contracts are designed for use on an international basis, and in other jurisdictions, fitness for purpose is, well, seems to be more readily acceptable to the supply chain, rightly or wrongly.
Okay, I've got a question here from Max Wiltshire about specifying a very minimal level of BIM in forthcoming contracts. I think we've got to leave that to people that are advising on BIM and integration. We can help you with that, but that's not really an NEC issue per se. What advice can you give regarding how to specify minimal BIM level? Please comment on how to prepare minimum level of employers' information requirements. It's a very big question. It's not one we're going to try and address just now. I can suggest.
Just come back to what we said at the start. Your BIM is moving. We can produce it today that could be outdated. You know, clients, I guess, will be introducing experts or specialists to help them in that particular field. Maybe they're designers, etc., who will have expertise in that arena as to what needs to be provided. You know, do we write it for level 1, level 2, level 3, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 6 dimensions? It's just too variable.
And it's just too variable, and it's up to you. Yeah, I'm not aware yet. So maybe somebody can. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware yet of any sort of standard to arise from the BIM world at some point.
And as we look at the CIC BIM protocol, it's a very good protocol. A lot of effort's gone into producing that. But again, that just contains the appendices which give a suggested contents list. It doesn't give the contents because of the challenge around that.
Okay, technical question here. I'll leave this one for Ian because it's a hard one. Does the contract discuss supplier's intellectual property which is shared within the model? E.g., a supplier has an advanced piece of equipment which they have developed. They share a 5D model of the equipment with the client. What's to stop a competitor copying that design?
Okay, well, again, it comes back to the idea of bi-party contracts. The ECC, PSC would bind those two parties. That the client has ownership of the information provided by the contractor, the consultant.
But that will depend what it says in the root contract, really, won't it?
Well, start again.
Sorry.
X10, the general or the starting point is that the data will go to the contractor. Okay, sorry, the data provided will be owned by the employer because they're going to need that to run their model. They have to have ownership of that data, that IPR in that sense. But it's only to use in relation to the model, and the idea is they would not then share it with others. I guess there's something there around possibly how you would protect security and access rights to other people, free access to the model, see everyone else's information. So that may be a combination of technical issues and legal issues to consider.
Okay, well, we've just been given the one last question from our team organizer here. So, I'll pick one. It's such power. As Ian said, what we normally do with these protocols, we normally try and get some written answers to these questions. Is that something we're going to try and do?
Don't get to cover off today.
Don't expect the answers today, but we'll try and get something to do that. CIC protocol obliges parties to attend meetings. How would you assess pricing for those meetings to fit the total of prices? Good question. No different from any other contract. How many meetings?
Well, that needs to be specified within the information model requirements.
And that's no different to any other. If you've got a contract which says you've got to come to meetings whenever I tell you, you've got to take the risk and you price it, or you try and caveat it with, I'm going to assume two meetings a month. I don't think that's particularly going to be it's no different from a BIM perspective from anything else. We're getting serious looks from across the table that it's time to wrap up.
Okay, so hopefully you found that of use today and it's been informative. As we say, we will try and come back and answer some of the questions we've not had a chance to deal with so far. Just in terms of closing out then, there are some additional things to highlight. the NEC User Group Annual Seminar is taking place on the 20th of June here in London at the County Hall. That's where we're going to release the ALC, the Alliance contract. We've got Dr. David Hancock speaking, Ian Arbuckle, David Ferrisant and Kevin Murray, talking through various aspects of NEC use and application.
Some big users of NEC, which is good to see.
Also, we have the Global Engineering Congress taking place on the 22nd, 26th of October, again, here in London. Details available on the IC website. And then another webinar is due on the 20th of NEC, and this is looking at supporting site engineers with mobile technology. So it's part of IC's digital transformation campaign.
Yeah.
Okay. And then still further things to cover off, which is there are some books and guides that are now available from NEC. So IC Publishing are producing various guides on how to transition to NEC4. So looking at NEC3 and NEC4 compared, looking at the role of the project manager and the supervisor within NEC4.
So those basically, some of those books have been updated, yeah, to cover off the small changes in NEC4. I think it's important to make people know that the changes in NEC4 are good, but they're not massive, they're not huge, but it's worth having the up-to-date versions.
Yeah.
And then carry on.
Yeah, a variety of different BIM training courses are available from ICE. The details on the screen here. I say these slides will be made available, but if you go to www.icetraining.org.uk/BIM, you can find full details of those and the dates and locations of those various training sessions. Okay, well, that's it from us for today. I say hopefully you found that of benefit. Apologies again if the IT wasn't great. Obviously, we'll look at that in future webinars, but hopefully you've got the content, the slides are there, and we'll follow up with some more Q&A as and when we get the written questions through.
Okay,
Richard, thank you for your time.
Thank you indeed. Cheers.